Hi, and welcome to this episode of Your Future, Your Finances. I'm your host, Brian Kuhn. Here we interview a variety of experts on the topics of personal finance, personal growth, and current events here in Maryland, D.C., and nationally. Here on this segment, we are going to be talking about what may be you and your family's largest asset, your home, and how to interact with that asset as you age. To help us do that, we have the opportunity to speak with Mr. Harvey Jacobs, attorney at Jacobs & Associates, based out of Rockville, Maryland. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian.
Appreciate it. Let's start with the different types of ways that you can hold and convey title to your house.
Okay. The most common way to hold title is for a married couple to hold it as tenants by the entirety. And that is the strongest form of ownership. It protects the house against creditors unless the creditor has a judgment against both owners, husband and wife. It can only be held by people who are married at the time they buy the house, or if they get married after the house, then they can change the deed. So that's the most common and the most protective way of holding it. It essentially says that the husband owns the house 100%, subject to the wife's 100%, and vice versa. A second way that a couple can own a property is joint tenants with rights of survivorship. And that would be in the case where they're not a married couple, because as I said, that's only eligible for tenants by the entirety. Joint tenants with rights of survivorship would be where it's a family member, for example, a brother, sister, parent, child, and they would want to own the property, and when the first one passes away, leave it to the other person. And the way that works is you technically don't own any particular percentage of the property at the time, but you do own it subject to the interests of all the other owners. So if there were 4 joint tenants with rights of survivorship, when they started, they would each own 25%. When the first one passed away, the remaining survivors would own a third each, etc., until the last person standing owns 100% of the house. In that way, each of the people that are the joint tenants, they're not able to actually convey that in their will or mortgage it or sell it to anybody else. It's subject to the other's interest. Finally, a tenancy in common is another way for joint ownership. For example, if you and I wanted to buy an investment property together, chances are we would buy it as tenants in common. And it can be whatever percentage we agreed to. So if it were 50-50, you could leave your 50% to your children or to your spouse. You could mortgage it if you could get someone to loan you money. I could leave it to my children, et cetera, et cetera. And so those are the 3 main ways that the title can be held.
So are there legal implications of each one that you would advise a household?
Yeah, the main thing relates to protection of the home from creditors. That's, as an attorney, that's sort of my role, is to protect one's home. And so if you're married, and now same-sex couples have that same privilege, if you will, of being able to own property as tenants by the entirety. That was one of the big changes when same-sex marriage was legalized and recognized, I should say. So they each have the protection. In a joint tenancy with rights of survivorship, the risks are that one of the joint tenants does something and gets a judgment against them, a fender bender or doesn't pay a credit card or something like that. Those creditors, if they get a judgment against one joint tenant, can attach that joint tenant's interest. Okay, but it can't affect the other joint tenant's interest, but it does affect it nonetheless because it's a cloud on title.
Yeah.
In a tenancy in common, you have that issue where if we owned this investment property together and say you had didn't pay a credit card, which I know you never would, wouldn't pay a credit card, but if you did and they got a $5,000 judgment against you, that becomes a lien against your 50% interest in that investment property.
How about naming a family member to a deed? Do you see that occur often where they're trying to protect the house from something?
I do. I get that call probably once a month. And while it may seem like a good idea to allow a mom, for example, to add the daughter to her deed because she wants the daughter to get the house upon her passing, it's generally speaking not a good idea to add a loved one to your deed. What it does is it dilutes your ownership, first of all, and God forbid there is a judgment against the daughter, that judgment attaches to mom's home. And so that's not something that the mom would typically think about. It also prevents the mom from perhaps doing a reverse mortgage in the future. If mom and daughter ever have a falling out and the daughter is in title, all owners, for example, of a house must sign the deed of trust. If you wanted to borrow money or refinance, you would need the daughter's consent. So there are many, many reasons not to add a loved one simply by adding them to the deed.
What do you think the goal that they're trying to accomplish is, and what's the best way to do so?
Yeah, I think what they're typically trying to do is to make sure that the house passes down to the child, for example, using that example. A good way to do that is to create what is called a revocable living trust. And what that does is it's a separate legal entity that is created, and then mom deeds the house directly to the revocable living trust. And while the mom is still alive, she can be the trustee and the beneficiary of that trust. And when mom passes, the daughter is essentially the beneficiary of that trust as well. And it doesn't have to go through probate. Nothing really changes. If mom passes and the house is in a revocable living trust with the daughter as the beneficiary, daughter just keeps on writing the checks or paying the utility bills and such. It's a much better way to accomplish that objective.
Let's say a viewer's watching this and they think, I don't know necessarily the exact title on the property or my own property between tenants by the entirety or joints with rights of survivorship. How do they find out?
Well, in Maryland, there's a website called marylandlandrec.net, run by the state. That has copies of all of the recorded deeds and deeds of trust. And so you can go to that website, put your name, your address in. If you know your lot and square, all the better. And then you can actually see an image of your deed. And that is the official record. I do settlements, and people sometimes call and say, oh, we've been in this house for 50 years, we don't have our original deed. Not to worry. All they have to do is really go to the website. And frankly, we do that as settlement attorneys. We go to the website, get the deed, we do the title search. We search back 60 years, in fact. So we can see everything that's been recorded on that property for 60 years. And but if they do want to check, they can go and look at their title, see if it says, husband and wife as tenants by the entirety, or if it's tenants in common or joint tenants, whatever the title is. It's a good practice to also put your marital status, whether it's a single person at the time or a married person, and that way title searchers know to look for a spouse out there.
Yep, absolutely. Now, since we have you, I want to switch gears a little bit because you also do, as I understand it, legal work in the state of Maryland related to internet assets and property. So let's say a viewer is watching, because it happens more and more nowadays, where someone has a site with traffic or a site that has business transactions. That's an asset and a property that you have to maintain, much like an offline one. What are some of the things people should be aware of with that?
Okay. Yeah, with bricks and mortar, it's pretty obvious if you're selling something in the store and somebody is harmed that they can sue you, in the local courthouse and file a claim. It's not quite as obvious if you're selling something on the internet. And a number of years ago, in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which governs the state of Maryland, they came up with a spectrum test to determine what it takes on your website to bring you within the jurisdiction of Maryland courts. The case came up specifically, my firm handled it. It was a California firm doing business in the state of Maryland, and the courts analyzed the situation, and of course the California company said, well, we just have a brochure on our website so that you can then call us and get a quote on the prices, et cetera, but we're not really doing business in Maryland. And the court said, well, we think you're doing more than just, that. In fact, they had an e-commerce enabled site. It allowed someone to, in fact, go to their site, purchase their goods, have them delivered to Maryland. The credit card transaction occurred in the state of Maryland. And so the issue for the courts was, if it is merely a brochure and you cannot complete the transaction online, then you're not subject to the Maryland courts. In other words, if they had to pick up the phone and call California and deal with California, Maryland courts would not take jurisdiction. On the other end of the spectrum was a complete transaction done, started continued and completed on the web, that clearly was going to subject you to the Maryland courts. Everything else in between was sort of a case-by-case basis, but for the people that are doing business now online more and more, take a hard look at your website, and if you don't have to actually have an e-commerce enabled website, then don't, because that'll subject you to the jurisdiction of courts. And especially since you never really know where people are going to see your message. I once did a terms and conditions for a client, and I got a call from somebody in Minnesota, and they said, "I just got sued in Maryland." And I'm like, "Well, why aren't you a Minnesota company?" They said, "Well, we got sued in Maryland, and when we looked at our website, it said that anybody that wants to sue us has to sue us in the state of Maryland and the county of Prince George's." I said, that sounds like something I wrote for one of my Maryland clients. Well, what had happened was they decided to try to cheap out, and they wound up just cutting and pasting my client's terms and conditions, put it in their Minnesota website, and wound up getting sued in Maryland because our choice of law said Maryland. So got to be careful about that. Don't cut and paste off the internet.
Yeah. And then for businesses that are exclusive to Maryland, I think we were speaking about some legislation that affects online businesses here.
Yes, I believe the Supreme Court just decided that online businesses can now be required to collect sales taxes even if they don't have bricks and mortar locations in that state. Up to this point, the issue was if you had a bricks and mortar store facility in the state, then you had to collect sales tax. But all the other bricks and mortar people were complaining because if you don't have a store in Maryland, you could sell something cheaper than the Maryland bricks and mortar. Now the Supreme Court said that difference is no longer going to be recognized. And states may, I don't think Maryland has yet enacted a sales tax for purely online transactions. But that could be coming down the pike such that it'll equal the playing field between the people that have bricks and mortar stores and the purely online stores. So something to look for, sales tax.
All right, well, very good. Appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Brian. Yep.
All right, so that does it for this segment. We appreciate the opportunity to air this content for you. If you have any questions for me or the guest, you can contact B. Kuhn at psgplanning.com. Thanks very much. We'll be right back.
For history, entertainment, great shopping and dining, Laurel's historic downtown Main Street is where you'll find it. The iconic Laurel Railroad Station is an important part of the community that preserves Laurel history. Catch a glimpse of both the historic train stop on the East End and the mill houses on the West End during the Laurel Walking Tour. And be sure to stop at the Laurel Museum, which is open for tours. Every May, large crowds fill downtown Laurel for the popular Main Street Festival. Great food, music, and even greater company are what guests come back to year after year. However, Main Street is something to be enjoyed every day of the year. With numerous boutiques and gift shops, that won't be hard to do. Stroll down Laurel's historic.
Welcome back. In this segment, we have the opportunity to discuss an important topic, regardless of what industry you're in sales or not, or where you are in your timeline to retirement, and that is the practice of good interpersonal communication. To discuss that topic, we have the opportunity to speak with Mr. Chad Prinke of Neuberger & Company, based out of Pikesville, Maryland. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about Sandler and the Neuberger system and yourself?
Yeah. I've been with Neuberger & Company for 10 years, and we are a business growth consulting firm. It really partners with our clients and focuses with them on different areas of business revolving around leadership, sales, account development, hiring, staffing, things along those lines. And the Sandler system is, so we're a Sandler licensee, and Sandler is a communication system that has been utilized to create best-in-class sales and management training. So when we do sales and management training, we're using the Sandler system to do that, which has been around a long time and made a major impact in our clients' businesses.
So if a viewer's watching, even if they're not in sales, but they want to communicate well with peers or colleagues or their boss, what are some of the basics of the system that they should keep in mind?
So the core of the system, I think, would be that people feel most comfortable with people who are familiar on some level. And what we can't do is change our backgrounds or where we're from or our stories to match people. And so what we have to do is kind of focus on what's in our control. And what's in our control is our body language and our tonality and the words that we're choosing given the situation. And so I think personal awareness and choosing what we call pick your presence, choosing how you want to be perceived in that interaction is probably the most universal tool. In other words, just be aware of your body language in a situation and be aware of your tonality in a situation and think before you speak.
So what are some examples of good body language?
Good body language. So how would you communicate to somebody that you were open to what they were saying? Think about how you would look if you wanted somebody to know that you were engaged and open to what they were saying. Chances are pretty good that you'd be looking them on center, and you'd have, your shoulders would be wide open, and your hands might not be, across your chest. Simple things like that. Good body language is the right body language for the situation, right? And so situational awareness and knowing, did they just share bad news with me, and do I look really excited about it? Or and did they just share really good news and I look disinterested? So I don't know that there's necessarily a good and bad body language. What there really is good and bad choices given the situation. And what I think most people could and should be working on is an understanding of what they look like and what their body is saying all the time.
So how about people, like differences, if you will, between like sales and then regular communication, or what do you teach the salespeople when you're walking through your systems?
Yeah, so if you think about a situation where you're trying to influence someone to do business with you. This, by the way, is universal. If you're a teacher, you're trying to influence someone to listen. If you're a manager, you're trying to influence someone to care or to follow direction. So the same basic principles apply, but there's something really special about this sales interaction, and that is that the person on the other side is highly likely to distrust you naturally based on their opinions, their preconceived notions about sales. And so think about that coming in, that you've got kind of a hurdle that you need to clear before you even can create a positive interaction. If I want to have a good sales interaction, I've got to clear that first hurdle, which is they don't trust me. So what we talk about with salespeople is really watch the people, watch your prospect's body language, see how they are conducting themselves, and subtly bring your body language into alignment with theirs, so that what you're not doing is creating yet another hurdle, which is that you're making them uncomfortable. What we don't talk about is smile big and shake their hand vigorously and things along those lines, because the truth is not everybody wants that. And so what we really train is to migrate to your customer, migrate to what their position is. And I would say, that while it's extremely important for a salesperson to do that, that's universal, right? So thinking about a teacher or thinking about heck, a doctor who wants you to take their advice, you know, or for that matter, a financial advisor.
Yeah, right. You also, in your systems, you talk about the culture of an organization. So there's one individual salesperson, but then there's also the culture that they're a part of. Can you talk about aspects of that?
Yeah, so the best-in-class companies that we've got the opportunity to work with, and we're fortunate enough to be a part of, one of the things that they'll say right out of the gate is they recognize that everyone in their company is in sales and everyone in their company is in customer service, and it really doesn't matter what their title is. And that's a cultural decision. There's a choice that that company has made to communicate a message to every employee, no matter who they are, that they're in the business of growing the business and protecting the business.
So I'm calling you from my computer. I hope I'm not
providing best-in-class customer service. So the culture that a company has around, belief systems toward the market and toward the customer is going to dictate how naturally the employees of that company provide customer service and look for opportunities to grow.
That's cool.
And you do training in these classes, both I guess on the culture and the sales. Why is the training so important?
So I got into sales.
If you, I was actually just in a conversation earlier that's a good example of this, where I was speaking with someone who is finding themselves frequently having to tell the same thing to the same people. That, in other words, they're making the same mistake over and over and over again. And I asked the question, have they received training on what good looks like? Do they know as a group what the standard is? And have you helped them to discover that that is important to the business and should be important to them personally? And the answer, invariably, when I run into that, and the answer earlier was, I guess I haven't. I guess I've been handling it each and every time saying, hey, that's not the way we do it. Hey, that's not the way we do it. And so in the absence of training, what you're going to have is the same mistake over and over and over again, and a lot of wasted time and energy, while you also get, suboptimal outcomes over and over and over again, until we set a standard, and then we can really coach and supervise against a standard. So that's why training's so critical.
Seems like that would apply to trying to raise young children.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's exactly right. If you haven't helped your kid to discover that it's important not to yell or to interrupt or whatever, if you haven't helped them to discover that, and if you haven't set the standard that this is how we conduct ourselves, you can't just yell at them every time they're out of line. They didn't know the expectation. They don't know the standard. So they're going to continue to make that mistake until you really step away and train the standard. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yep. So it's a good economy here in Maryland and nationwide. Lots of hiring, unemployment's low. What do you think is the main role or job that's tough to find these days?
So good managers and good leadership continues to be, I think, probably the most difficult position to staff for. I mean, obviously you have very industry-specific constraints, like in the construction industry, that blue-collar workforce is getting smaller and smaller and tougher to find, and so that's really hard to staff, right? Obviously, here in our area, there's a huge, demand for tech, and so there's, a small pool of those people available. But I think the thing that's universal across every industry that we're working in is people who can truly manage, and this is kind of an important differentiator, is to say these aren't just people who are like coming up with cool ideas and have a manager's title. These are people who understand how to manage behavior to a result, and to do that in a way that actually makes people who work for them happy. That's the hardest position we find, to staff.
Yep. Fantastic. Well, thanks for your time. What's your website where people can find you?
Yeah, so we're at newberger.sandler.com. And on our site, one of the things that you'll find is a training calendar. And if you interact with, there's a live chat on our site. If anybody would like to attend a session, their first session is always on us. And so you can take a look at what we have in our foundations and mastery schedule, and we'd love to have you as a guest.
Fantastic. Well, appreciate it very much. We've run out of time for this segment. We thank you for watching Your Future, Your Finances, and hope you have some takeaways. I'm your host, Brian Kuhn, and if you have any questions for the show or one of the guests, you can contact me at bkuhn@psgclarity.com. Lastly, as always, a thank you to Laurel TV for their production and airing of this segment. You can watch the show every Sunday at 10 a.m. on Comcast Channel 71 and 996 for HD, and Verizon Channel 12, or on the live stream at laureltv.org. See you next time.